A lot of times when Calvinists and Arminians talk, we tend to talk past each other rather than getting to the heart of the issue. I've heard from a lot of Calvinists who say that they are constantly misrepresented by Arminians, and I as an Arminian know that it is often rare that I find a Calvinist truly understands where Arminians are really coming from. Since I'm not a Calvinist, I don't want to speak for Calvinists about what they believe they've been misrepresented on, but I would like to speak on the Arminian perspective, where I think a lot of Calvinists tend to misrepresent Arminians, specifically on the issue of free will. The first thing that Calvinists often believe about Arminians is that they think we believe that individuals have an innate ability to come to Christ. Arminians do believe that we are able to accept or reject the gospel, but every Arminian believes that that is only the case if God chooses to draw the person through the power of the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit must act on a person and enable them to have the free will in order to accept or reject him. So Arminians do not believe that it is possible for a person to come to Christ on their own or to accept or reject him on their own. The second misconception is that Arminians think that God cannot override human free will. Now, this is understandable because I'm sure there are a lot of people who believe that God cannot, under any circumstance, violate human free will or prevent somebody from having libertarian free will in a certain instance. But most careful Arminians don't take this stance. For example, in 1 Samuel 19, we see that Saul sends several bands of soldiers after David to try to capture or kill him. And during this story, every time that Saul sends another group of soldiers, they immediately begin prophesying. And then Saul goes out himself and he starts prophesying uncontrollably. It even suggests that he strips all his clothes while doing so. Additionally, we have the example of Nebuchadnezzar, who has his rational mind taken from him. That is not something that he volunteered to do. We don't think that that's a libertarian free choice. So I think careful Arminians would say that God desires for humans to in general have free will. In order to enable us to have free will, to accept or reject him, God sends his Holy Spirit, enabling all people to accept Christ, to accept the good news, and to accept salvation that has now gone into the world. But we don't believe that that would make God unjust if, for some instance, he did want to interfere with human freedom. We just believe that, on the whole, he chooses for his creation to have a certain level of human libertarian free will. Now, this last misconception is the one that I think is the most difficult for the human mind to understand, which is why I think a lot of Calvinists tend to misrepresent the Arminian position. But basically, the misconception is that Arminians think that the reason why someone chooses the gospel and not the other person is because the person who chooses the gospel had something innate in them. Either they were smarter, or maybe they were more wise, or maybe they're more noble or moral than the other person. In any case, the Calvinist thinks that, according to Arminianism, the one person has to have some sort of quality in them that made them choose the gospel, and the other person didn't have that quality, in which case they did not choose the gospel. But that would actually be to contradict Arminian teaching, because Arminians believe in libertarian free will. And libertarian free will is the idea that you have the full ability to accept or reject Christ. So if we think through it, if somebody chose the gospel because they were wiser, that means that their wisdom was the thing that determined their choice. But Arminians don't believe that choices are determined by anything but the person choosing. So according to Arminianism, the choice of accepting the gospel or the choice of rejecting the gospel was not determined by anything, because we're not determinists. We don't believe in determinism. So when you ask the question, what determined your choice to accept the gospel and determined the other person to not accept the gospel, you're assuming a view of freedom that's more similar to the Calvinistic compatibilist version of free will, not the Arminian version of free will. Well, you might say that that's a logical contradiction, but at least now we're arguing over what Arminians truly believe. All this video is intended to do is to say that if you believe that somebody chose the gospel because of some quality in them, essentially what you're saying is they had to choose that because they had that quality. But Arminians don't believe that. Arminians believe that you can choose one or the other, no matter what qualities you have. So a wise person can accept the gospel and a foolish person can accept the gospel. All that matters is that they choose to accept the gospel. If you are ever in a conversation with somebody who disagrees with you, whether they be a Calvinist, an Arminian, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Jewish person, no matter what the instance is, you should always seek to listen before you try to attack somebody for what they don't believe. Now, this video has been about how Arminianism can be misrepresented, but if you want to see how a distorted version of Arminianism truly leads to really dangerous consequences, then check out this video because it's very important and it explains exactly how.